Welcome back to VATSIM 101, everybody, where we're going to be talking about everybody's biggest fear, ATC communication. Now, I know there's a lot of anxiety when it comes to talking on the radio. Even the first time that I did it in the real world, I was really nervous about keying up that mic for the first time. There's a lot of different things that you're going to need to be able to know, a lot of different things that you're going to be expected to say and do, but we're going to break all of that down in this video. Once you take that leap and you make that first transmission, you're going to want to do it over and over again. It becomes very addicting, very fast. Now, before we start getting into exactly what it is that we're supposed to say and do when it comes to talking to air traffic control, let's go over some do's and don'ts for when you're making those radio transmissions. Firstly, you want to speak clearly and concisely using proper radio phraseology. You don't want to use any slang or shortcuts because you can confuse people, especially when it comes to flying in different countries. Stick to the ICAO standards and you are going to be okay. Anytime you are given an instruction by air traffic control, you want to make sure you read back that instruction fully and state your call sign or your tail number at the end of it. That way the controllers know that the proper aircraft has responded to them. A lot of times you could have airplanes that are out there with very similar call signs, and if you were just to read back an instruction but not say your call sign, it would be very, very hard to determine what aircraft has just responded to that controller. One of the biggest things when it comes to just flying in VATSIM in general is knowing how to operate the aircraft that you're using. Being on VATSIM, especially under the direction of air traffic control, is not the time when you want to start learning how to fly a new plane. A380 pilots are punching the air right now. Even me, when it comes to flying a new plane, at the time this video is recorded, I'm going through the painstaking process of learning the friggin' McDonnell Douglas MD-80. It's a very complex plane, so rather than me trying to fight that plane while I'm also trying to communicate with air traffic control, I've been doing flights with it off the network until I am comfortable enough to at least be able to hand fly that plane in the event that something goes wrong. If for some reason air traffic control gives you an instruction and you are not able to follow it, whether it's a limitation with the plane or maybe it's something that is not safe for you to do, let the controllers know. Just because air traffic control gives you an instruction does not mean that you are automatically obligated to abide by it. Now, that's not your get out of jail free card to just not do something because you don't feel like it. It has to be something that's reasonable. So if the controller tells you to do something, like if they tell you to descend to an altitude that's going to put you on a collision path of the mountain, probably not something that you're going to want to do, and you'll want to question it. You also don't want to just assume that you can do something without clarifying it with air traffic control. So if you're flying on a certain procedure and it looks like you may be expected to do something but you're not really sure about it, call up the controller and ask them. The last thing you want to do is start turning in a direction or climbing or descending to an altitude that you're not supposed to be going to. I would also highly recommend that you start at a smaller airport that you are familiar with maybe one or two different types of air traffic controllers that are online. This way, you're at an airport that's not going to be hard for you to navigate. The procedures going in and out of there are going to be relatively straightforward and not too complex. And with a lack of traffic that's there, it will allow the controllers time to be able to help you if you do have any questions or you find yourself getting a little stuck. The last thing that you want to do when it comes to learning VATSIM is to go to some of these bigger events like Friday or Saturday Night Ops, or something that's really busy and very complex that can get you overwhelmed very quickly. And if you do find yourself getting overwhelmed on the network, key up your radio, say, hey, I'm getting a little overloaded, or I can't handle it. Disconnect from the network. There's no shame in doing it. There is no one out there that is going to judge you for disconnecting from the network because you were getting a little overwhelmed. You also don't want to assume that you are allowed to do something if you were not told specifically by air traffic control. Let's talk about the different types of airspace for a second. We're not going to get into all of the different requirements and procedure that is required for these different types of airspace. We're specifically going to be going over what is expected when it comes to talking to air traffic control. We have two different categories of airspace: controlled airspace and uncontrolled airspace. Controlled airspace is under the direction of air traffic control, while uncontrolled airspace is not. The different types of controlled airspace that you're going to see are Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo require communication with air traffic control prior to entering that airspace. Class Echo airspace is a little different. Airplanes flying VFR in Class Echo are not required to have any communications at all, while aircraft that are flying under IFR flights are. So it is important to note that while you're flying around Class Echo airspace, there could be some planes that are flying around you that are not under the direction of air traffic control. Now, air traffic control will be able to point those aircraft out to you, so that way you're aware that they're out there and you can keep your eyes on them, but that particular plane may not actually be communicating with that controller. Uncontrolled airports are very small airports, so if you're somebody that's flying a big airliner, flying into some of these bigger airports, you're not generally going to be operating in airspace like this. But the two different types of uncontrolled airspace are Foxtrot and Golf. Class Foxtrot airspace is more of a European thing, and from my understanding, it's relatively rare. In the United States, where I primarily fly, we don't have Class Foxtrot airspace, so I don't really know exactly what that is, but I know it is something that is rare to see, even in countries that do have it. If you are flying into an uncontrolled airport, you will be expected to communicate on the Common Traffic Advisory frequency. We already have a video that breaks down what that is and how you're supposed to properly use it, so if this is the first time you're hearing about the Common Traffic Advisory frequency, I would definitely recommend you go watch that video. On VATSIM, we have 5 different types of air traffic controllers. We have clearance delivery, ground control, tower control, approach and departure control. You're going to hear me say approach and departure kind of interchangeably because you call them approach when you're arriving and departure when you're leaving. So it's the same controller, they're just identified differently depending on your phase of flight. And center control. Clearance delivery control is going to provide you the details for your planned flight. So when you follow your flight plan, the controller is going to look at the type of plane that you're flying, what your origin and destination are, the route that you're going to fly, the altitude you're going to be at. They're also going to look at weather reports and any traffic conflicts that may happen along the way. And there may be times where they change your flight plan on you. Sometimes they may change 1 or 2 things. Sometimes they may amend the entire flight plan for you. If they do make any changes to that flight plan, they're going to make those changes and let you know so you can adjust accordingly. But just know the flight plan that you filed is not necessarily the flight plan you're going to fly. It's just the flight plan that you are asking for. The ground controller controls all movements on the taxiways. Sometimes they control parts of the ramp depending on the airport. For the most part, the ramp areas are going to be uncontrolled, but that's going to come down to the specific airport that you're operating at. If you're ever unsure of whether or not you should be contacting ground control for push and start, give the controller a call and ask them. Worst case, they tell you it's at your discretion and you just call them when you're ready to taxi. The tower controller controls all of the movements on the runways and all airborne traffic, usually within a 10 nautical mile ring of the airport. So those are the controllers that are going to clear you for takeoff and landing. The approach and departure controllers are going to control all of the airborne traffic within their airspace, usually at lower altitudes, flying into or out of a specific airport. The center controllers also control all airborne traffic within their airspace, but it's going to be at higher altitudes, mainly during your cruise phase of flight. There are some exceptions to that. There are some smaller airports that don't have approach and departure control, so the center controllers will take over in that respect for those smaller airports. But for the most part, the center controllers handle all of the high altitude traffic. The normal flow when it comes to talking to air traffic control is you start your flight talking to clearance delivery control, then you're going to get switched over to ground control for your taxi, tower control for your takeoff, departure control for your initial climb, and then the center controller for your climb up to your cruising altitude. Then when it comes time to descend, the center controller gives you that initial descent clearance, you're handed off to the approach controller for your final descent down into the airport, switched over to tower for landing, and then ground control is going to give you instructions on how to get to your gate. The controllers are going to hand you off to the next controller when it is time to switch frequencies. So you're not going to have to memorize at what point you're supposed to contact the next controller. The air traffic controllers themselves are specifically going to tell you what facility to contact and on what frequency you are going to do it on. VATSIM does operate in a top-down structure when it comes to ATC coverage. We're going to talk about this here in just a minute, but because VATSIM is a voluntary organization, there are going to be times where some or all of the different air traffic controllers are not going to be online to help you. So VATSIM has implemented the top-down structure, meaning that the controllers that are at the top of this list right here in front of you can substitute for the controllers that fall beneath them if those controllers are not online. Now, if there are no air traffic controllers that are online, you would make position reports on the Common Traffic Advisory frequency like in the CTAF video I had recommended before. Right here, we have the ATC Coverage Tool. There's no dark mode for it. I apologize. I know it's burning your eyeballs out, but bear with me here. This is an interactive tool that you can use to help you figure out what controller it is that you are supposed to be talking to. So if we scroll all the way down to the bottom of this page here, we're going to see this little interactive switchboard with all of the different types of air traffic controllers. So we're just going to turn all of these on. This is kind of hard to do with, hand controllers. So now all the different types of air traffic controllers are highlighted. And right next to it, it tells us exactly what all of those air traffic controllers do, with the exception of the one at the very bottom, which is the ATIS. We have another video on what that is and how you're supposed to use it. If this is the first time you're hearing about the ATIS, go watch that video. It's going to explain all of that in detail for you. So when all the air traffic controllers are online, it's going to follow that flow that we had talked about earlier. Now, this next page I'm going to show you is the VATSIM Radar. So this is an interactive map that's going to show you all the pilots and controllers that are connected to the network all across the world. Now, you can see over here at Chicago, we have a whole bunch of air traffic controllers that are online, but not every single type of controller that can be online is online. So if we take a look at Chicago O'Hare specifically, we can see that we have a center controller in the overlying area. We have the approach and departure controllers, but at O'Hare itself, there's no tower controller, ground controller, or clearance delivery controller. I know the colors are different than what the ATC Coverage Tool shows. The VATSIM Radar is a relatively new map, and the ATC Coverage Tool uses VATSPY, which is a different independent flight tracking network. The colors may change, but the message remains the same. Now, taking in mind the controllers that are at Chicago, let's come back over to the ATC Coverage Tool. So we have a center controller and an approach controller, but we don't have tower, ground control, or clearance delivery control. And you're going to see on the Coverage Tool, the approach controller has dropped down into tower, ground, and clearance delivery, meaning that approach control is going to handle clearance, ground, tower, and approach and departure controls. They're going to do all of that for us. Let's take a look at another example. So we're going to come up here to Minneapolis. At Minneapolis, we only have a tower controller that's online. So we come back over to the ATC Coverage Tool, we deselect center control, approach control, and just highlight the tower controller. Now tower control takes over for ground and clearance delivery, but when you depart the tower's airspace, you would no longer be under the direction of air traffic control, and you would be responsible for yourself on the advisory frequency. So you can play with this tool as much as you need to, depending on what airport you're flying out of and how many controllers are online, to know exactly who it is that you're supposed to be calling. I'm going to have the link for both the ATC Coverage Tool and the VATSIM Radar in the description of this video for you. When it comes to keying up that radio for the first time and talking to the controller, there is a standard way that we are going to communicate so the controller knows exactly what it is that we want to do. Here at VATSIM 101, we call this the 4 whiskeys of radio communication. So the 4 whiskeys are who you're calling, who you are, what your position is, and what your request is. Now, we have 4 whiskeys for when we're on the ground and when we're in the air because it does change slightly, but they all have the same idea. So the first whiskey is who we're calling. That is going to be the station ID of the controller we are trying to get a hold of. SoCal Approach, Birmingham Tower, Chicago Center, just as a few examples. The second whiskey is who we are. That is going to be either our call sign or our tail number, whichever way we decided to identify ourselves for this particular flight. The third whiskey is what our position is. That's going to be our physical location on the field, whether it's a gate number, ramp number, or what apron we're on. Ideally, you want to make this as specific as possible so it's easy for the controllers to find you. Because if you're at an airport like Chicago O'Hare or Las Vegas, where there's hundreds of different gates and different areas on the airport you can be, by telling them what specific gate or ramp number you're at, it's going to make it very easy for them to find you. The fourth whiskey is what our request is. Clearance to your destination, your taxi instructions for departure, or your takeoff clearance. When you make contact with ground control for your taxi instructions, make sure you are telling them what ATIS information you have. That way they know that you have reviewed it. If you do forget to tell them, they are going to ask you to verify that you have the current ATIS information. Once we're in the air, the 4 whiskeys change just a little bit. So the first 2 are still going to be the same, who we're calling and who we are. The third whiskey is what we're doing. This is going to be in reference to the altitude you're climbing or descending to, or the altitude that you're level at. So for example, if we're departing out of Chicago and we're climbing through 1,700 feet and we're assigned an altitude of 5,000, we'll tell the controller we're at 1,700 climbing to 5,000. Or if we're level at 3,000 feet, we'll tell the departure controller we are level at 3,000. The fourth whiskey is what other assignments we have, whether it's a speed restriction, a heading we're supposed to maintain, or a specific fix that we were told to fly to. Additionally, you can tell them what departure, arrival, or approach you're flying on, just so they're aware of exactly what it is that you're doing. That is usually something that the previous controller is going to make them aware of, but if you did want to reiterate it, you can do that as well. When you make your initial contact with approach control on your descent, you want to make sure that you tell them the ATIS information you have. And just like before we talked about with ground, if you do forget to mention that you have the ATIS information, the controller is going to ask you to verify that you have reviewed it. Here we have a sheet that I developed, which I have called the ATC cheat sheet, mainly because this is where you're going to be given a lot of information that you're going to want to write down in order to ensure that you don't forget it. So right up here at the top, we have the 4 whiskeys. That way you don't forget what they are. And then down here for clearance delivery, we have the formatting for the 4 whiskeys. At the bottom, we have an acronym called CRAFT. This is how the clearance delivery controller is going to give you your flight plan clearance. The C is your clearance limit, which is going to be your destination. The R is your route of flight. The A is the altitude, which is going to be an initial altitude followed by a higher altitude within a certain amount of time, the frequency that you're going to contact for departure control, and then finally the transponder code that you're going to put into the airplane's transponder. Down below that, we have push and start, whether it's at your discretion or call a certain frequency ready to taxi. Down below, we have the template for ground control, both for when you're taxiing out and taxiing in. And again, it's in the 4 whiskey format at the top, and how the controller is going to give you that instruction is listed down below. And then finally, for tower control, very straightforward. This is how you're going to let the controller know that you are ready to take off. So this sheet is something that I am actively working on, and there may be changes to it over time just to improve upon it, but this will be able to help you with any flights that you do. Next, we're going to go over a couple of common terms that you may hear from the different types of air traffic controllers, because they can be a little confusing or tricky if you've never heard them before. So with clearance delivery, you may hear what is called a pre-departure clearance, or a PDC. That is when they are going to text you your clearance rather than giving it to you verbally over the radio. The second is when you hear cleared as filed or cleared via your flight plan route. That means that the route that you have filed for is the route that has been approved by air traffic control, so they've made no changes to your flight plan. Flight plan amendment means that air traffic control has made a change to your flight plan, and they're going to let you know what that is. Any amendments to your flight plan are usually going to be given to you verbally. That way the controllers know that you are aware of it. You may hear climb via SID. That means that you are going to be expected to follow all of the altitude and speed restrictions on the departure route. A lot of times when you hear that, they are not going to tell you what altitude you are going to be maintaining, because that is all going to be listed on that departure. So make sure you're reading those charts thoroughly. Squawk is a term that we use to refer to the transponder. If they tell you to squawk a number, that means you're going to put that number into the airplane's transponder. You may also hear it referred to as a beacon code. Push and start approved, or push at pilot discretion, means that you can push back whenever you are ready, and you will contact the ground controller when you are ready to taxi. Call ready for push means that you must get permission from the controller before you push back from the gate. Sometimes the clearance delivery controller is going to give you that clearance. Other times it will be the ground controller that does. So make sure you pay attention if you are told to call when ready for push. When you're with ground control, some of the terms you may hear are listed here. Spot number is the one that confuses a lot of people the most. Arch NDA right now is very, very closely monitoring this video. Spot numbers are going to be on the airport charts. Depending on the scenery that you're using for your airport, it may be on the ground as well. But if a controller tells you to call at a certain spot number, you are going to be expected to taxi to that spot number first and then contact air traffic control. Some airports where spot numbers are common are Boston, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and JFK. Hold short is exactly as it sounds. You are going to hold short of whatever position you have been instructed, whether it is a runway, a taxiway, or even sometimes at a spot number. Just make sure you're not proceeding past that point. Cross means, other than my name, is going to be in reference to a runway. So that is a controller specifically telling you to cross a certain runway, meaning that you do have permission to cross that runway. Monitor refers to a frequency. Most commonly, you are going to hear a controller tell you to either monitor ground or monitor the tower. This means that you are going to switch to that frequency and you're going to wait for the controller to call you. Most of the time when you are told to monitor a frequency, it's because those particular controllers are very busy and they don't want 100 planes calling into them at the same time, letting them know they're on the frequency. Just want to reiterate, when you're told to monitor a frequency, switch to that frequency. Do not call the controller. They are going to call you. If you are told to contact a controller on a frequency, that means you're going to switch to that frequency and then tell the controller that you are on the frequency with them. Tower controllers, the only one that may trip you up is when you are told to line up and wait. This means that you are going to line up on the runway in the direction that you're going to take off, but you're not actually going to move anywhere. You're going to hold your position and wait for the controllers to give you further instructions. OGs are going to remember this as taxi into position and hold. When you are given your takeoff clearance, the tower controller may also tell you what the winds are. That is just for your information so you know how to put your aileron corrections in. You are not expected to read back the wind information to the controller, only your takeoff clearance. When you're talking to approach and departure and center control, there are a lot of different instructions that you can get, and some of them can get a little confusing. The first two we're going to talk about are climb and descend and maintain, and climb and descend. If you are told to climb or descend and maintain an altitude, that means you can proceed to that altitude unrestricted. The controller may straight up just tell you climb or descend unrestricted. So this means that you do not have to follow any altitude restrictions that are on any of the charts that you are using for reference. Now, if you are just told to climb and descend, you will be expected to adhere to any restrictions that apply. When you are cleared for an approach, whether it's an ILS, an RNAV, or a visual, etc., 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 the speed, heading, and altitude are going to be at your discretion while making sure that you also abide by all of the restrictions on the approach that you're flying. As mentioned before, we have climb via SID or descend via star. That means that you are going to start your climb and descent at your discretion while adhering to all of the speed and altitude restrictions on that particular chart. Direct fix is pretty self-explanatory. A controller is going to tell you to fly directly to a fix, and at that point, you're going to start tracking directly to the fix that you've just been told. Another term you may hear is resume on navigation. That means you are going to continue your flight as planned. You're going to hear that a lot if a controller gives you a heading to turn to that's off of your flight plan. Once they tell you to resume on navigation, you can then start turning back towards your flight plan route. And that'll wrap up today's video, everybody. I know we covered a lot today, so if you do have any further questions, you can feel free to leave them in the comments section down below. I'd be more than happy to answer those questions for you. I know communicating with air traffic control is something that is very intimidating, and it can seem really scary, and you're afraid of messing something up, but I promise you, the first time that you make that radio call to air traffic control, you're going to find yourself wanting to do it again. And don't be afraid of making mistakes. That's how we learn. Everybody makes mistakes, whether you have 3 hours on VATSIM or if you have 3,000 hours on VATSIM. No one's going to make fun of you. No one's going to yell at you. The worst that can happen is a controller is going to tell you that you didn't do something correctly, and they're just going to tell you how to do it properly for future reference. So thanks for tuning into today's video, everybody, and until next time, this is Cross Hyperu, signing out.